Hello, welcome, and thank you from the Mockingbird Foundation for tuning in to watch this Tapers panel discussion about the recording of live Grateful Dead and Phish concerts from approximately 1977 to 1997. My name is Charlie Dirksen, and I am a founding board member of the foundation. Mockingbird is entirely run by volunteers and is a 501c3 nonprofit. Mockingbird began in October 1996 as a project by volunteer Phish fans to compile factual information about Phish's music into a book, a dead base for Phish fans, so to speak, with profits to benefit music education programs for children and young adults. That book was the Phish Companion, and there have been 3 editions of it published in the last 20 years. Foundation volunteers have also been responsible for the management and content of Phish.net, which is an ongoing project of the foundation. The foundation has distributed over $1.6 million in grants for music education programs, with the first grants awarded 20 years ago in May 2001. Like other Phish fans, the volunteers who started Mockingbird almost 25 years ago benefited enormously from the efforts of tapers who recorded and circulated live recordings of Phish's music in the 1980s and 1990s. Today for this panel, I'm joined by 6 tapers who made thousands of recordings from the 1970s through the 1990s of live improvisational rock concerts. Many of their recordings are available to listen to for free on archive.org or via relisten.net. First, we'll speak with Dr. Robert Wagner and Charlie Miller about Grateful Dead taping in the 1970s and 1980s, and then with Parker Harrington, Todd, Ahrens, Eliot, Byron, and Craig Hillwig about Phish taping in the 1980s and 1990s. Some of you may have heard of Dr. Bob, as he's commonly known. Dr. Bob, would you please tell us about your first Grateful Dead show and also how and why you began recording Grateful Dead shows in the 1970s?
Sure. My first shows were the Academy of Music. I went to 3 of them in March of 1972. I was already a fan before I saw my first shows. My greatest decision each day coming home from high school was which side of Live Dead do I listen to first. But I did get to go to those 3 at the Academy of Music and have been hooked ever since. My first recording would have been at Englishtown in 1977. My reason is because I became a taper because it was just so difficult to get tapes by trading, etc. You had to know somebody back then. Some of the people who had good tapes didn't want to trade them or didn't let anybody copy theirs. Others treated it like a business deal, like they had to get the better end of the tape trade. And I really wanted to just hear the music. My love of the other aspects of taping in terms of creating something, being an artist and making all the decisions that tapers make came later. Really, at first, it was about just being able to hear the music.
And you actually recorded most of one of the tours by the Grateful Dead in 1978, is that correct?
Yeah, my first real big tour was April of 1978. And I went to probably about 8 of the shows on that tour, playing hooky for medical school because I knew I was going to pass somehow. Our grades were pass-fail, so I would figure it out in the long run. That was really an amazing time in many ways. Not just taping, but just going to so many shows in a row. You get to know so many people.
Now, going into the 1980s, you continued to tape Grateful Dead shows, right?
Yes.
And you were...
I taped right up until the end, until 95.
So was your last show, a Grateful Dead show, Shoreline then in 1995?
Right. I think it was June of 1995.
And
I don't
then,
listen to that era now, so I can't tell you the exact date.
right. And you taped from the lawn at that show, right?
Yeah, over the years, I evolved into thinking that I could actually have more fun and make better tapes on the lawn at Shoreline because they had secondary speakers set up on the lawn and the sound was actually pretty good there. Shoreline has funny acoustics. If you were up close, you didn't necessarily have good sound.
Now, going back to the 1980s, just generally speaking in the 1980s, if I remember correctly, you mentioned to me earlier that you were wholly taping front of board, front of the soundboard, FOB, and never in the taper section. Is that right? Can you explain why?
That's correct. And that's because, well, there's the obvious reason that the tapes come out better if you're closer to the source. But that wasn't even my primary reason. Even to this day, when I'm listening, when I'm seeing my favorite bands such as ALO or Goose or Dawes, I've got to get my ears to a place where the sound is best, or I'm not having fun. If I happen to have a seat that's way up in the rafters, it might be the greatest show ever, but I'm really not having fun if I don't hear good sound. So I really evolved a system of recording front of board, which was not allowed after the tapers section was created in 1984. But generally, it was not enforced. And so I often handheld the mics or set up a stand when we were able to, or even wore the mics in the later years and a hat on my head.
Did what mics did you typically use when you were taping FOB in the 1980s?
Yeah, I've been throughout my taping career ever since 1979, been using Nakamichi 700 microphones. Before I used a couple other microphones for 1977 and 78, but it's been the Nakamichis ever since then. And they also have the advantage for stealth taping of being miniaturized. There are people such as Mark Severson and Jamie Porras who found a way to miniaturize the mics so that they were easy to conceal, say in a hat for taping, for example.
Thank you, Bob. Let's speak now with Charlie Miller, who is on the line. Hi, Charlie.
How you doing?
Good. So, you know, we just talked a little bit about the taper sections. My understanding, Charlie, that you were actually present in the earliest taper section at Grateful Dead shows. Could you tell us about that, as well as, of course, your Dead resume, so to speak, your first show and why you got into taping?
My first show was in '79. It was November 2nd. It was the night before my 16th birthday, and so I went into the show. I was 15, and it ended. I was 16, which is kind of a cool thing. I noticed all the mic stands around, and I was surprised there was as many as they had, because I was collecting tapes back since '77 or '78. But I mean, there was a lot of stands, and in '83, I was doing the complete full spring tour and I was sitting one night in Vermont, and everybody around me had a tape deck. I was in the middle of a chain of tape decks, and if I had one, I could have patched in. And I was thinking, man, I need to get a tape deck. So on the way to the next show, I got a Sony D6 and taped the rest of the tour with it, which was a lot of fun. And eventually I switched to a D5, but yeah, I taped from '83 all the way through to '94, the end of '94.
And generally speaking, did you patch out of people who were, you know, had mics that you appreciated, or did you have your own set of mics and I'm speaking really about the mid '80s to the late '80s?
Well, when I first started, I was patching, but by '89, '90, I got my own mics, and I had a friend who had a pair of mics, and I bought a 4-mic mixer. So we would bring 4 mics to the shows, and we would mix them right there, and it was a lot of fun.
And that was like basically '89 through '94 that you would mix them as well?
Yeah, we were doing that '89 through. Actually, we went to the 4-mic mix in '90 at Cal Expo, and we did that through '93. And then on the fall tour in '93, I didn't bring my mics on tour with me, but I brought a deck, so I was just patching then. And then after that, we just did various things in '94.
When you were doing the 4-mic mix, what mics were you using?
We had Nakamichi shotguns and AKG cardioids. And I had a little Boss BX4 mixer. It ran on a 9-volt battery. It was pretty cool. You know, it was a lot of fun.
Do you recall any particular taping experiences, particularly around the time in 1984 when when GDTS, if I remember correctly, because I had to look it up, when they first offered a tapers ticket, do you remember there being like some politically sensitive, so to speak, issues with respect to tapers and
Well, it was
non-tapers?
basic. I mean, it was basically Dan Healy couldn't see the stage because of all the microphone stands, and there was a lot of issues with people all over the place with microphone stands. So they created the section right behind the soundboard, and you needed a ticket to get in there, and it kind of cleaned things up, but it also made front of board taping illegal. But those were the better tapes. You know, that's where we used to all go in the front of the board because it sounds better there. So some people moved to the section, some stayed front of board. Me personally, with the 4 mics, there's no way I can go front of board. They would see that thing sticking out and they would kick me out. So I kind of had to go with the rules.
Well, generally speaking, from let's say like 1985 until your last Dead show in late '94, do you think that the taper section expanded, or was it
was
always
crazy.
pretty big?
Yeah, it got really big. At one show in Compton Terrace in Arizona in December 1990, I had 35 people patched off of me. It was a line of tape decks that wrapped all the way around the taper section. I counted it, and it was 35. And that was just my one microphone stand with my 4 mics. And there was probably about another 40 stands there. You know, everybody had a bunch of people patched out of them. There was a lot of tapers, you know, as the years went on.
Thank you. Thank you, Charlie. Let's speak now with Parker Harrington, who many of you watching, if you're Phish fans on Twitter, may know through Twitter. His Twitter handle is @TMWSIY. Parker, you still there?
I sure am, Charlie.
Hi, good to see you. So thank you again for joining us today for this. Parker, would you please tell us about the first times you saw Phish and the first time you started recording their shows in the 1980s?
Yeah, they were, those 2 times were pretty close to each other. And first of all, before I get going any further, thanks for inviting me on here, because I love reflecting back on this time, like 87, 88, 89, 90, 91. I've had a lot of great highlights in my life. I've had a lot of good chunks of time where I can look back at, 3-4 year sections, decade sections, but that section right there, that was one of the highlights. That was one of the happiest, funnest times of my life. And a lot of it came down to Phish. And it was 85 or 86 that my friend introduced me to Phish just through a couple of cassette tapes. And I didn't latch onto it at all. It didn't resonate with me whatsoever. I mean, I was starting to listen to the Grateful Dead, by no means a Deadhead, but more like Bowie, Floyd, U2, kind of whatever else was on the radio, not really into the taping culture. And come fall of 87 at college, Phish was playing. And I was like, I gotta go check out that band that Jeff used to like. And, I saw that first show, and then second and third and fourth and fifth. And before I knew it, it was only several months later, and I'd been up to like 10 or 15 shows. And I kept on trying to explain to a handful of my friends, you guys don't get it. You guys, this band is unbelievable. You got to listen to them. And at the time, the only tape that I had was, a couple of tapes with a couple of demo reels. The white tape had just come out. So that was one of the tapes that I had been given initially. But that's kind of an odd thing to introduce people to. So I wanted to let people hear the music I was hearing. So I went out and bought a little portable Sony cassette deck. It was one of the ones, the Walkman size, but it wasn't a Walkman per se. And a little plug-in stereo microphone about the size of a quarter. And I would just stick it on the stage every show I went to. And the tapes came out great. A lot of these clubs were tiny and 40 people, 30 people, and they weren't amplified. It was just there was no monitor. It was just the instruments on the stage. So sticking a little tape deck on the stage picked up just as good as anything that would have elsewhere. But the clubs were getting slightly bigger, and I wanted to slightly upgrade. So I plopped a few $100 down on a Marantz tape deck and a tripod and some better AKG microphones, and kept on taping. And it was probably 100, 125 shows that I taped. And then it got into the point where people were investing thousands in not even microphones, just in power conditioning and preamps and stuff like that. And I, people love my tapes and I love trading them. And I knew a lot of people. And then, I remember one time someone came up to the taper section and I'd missed, 6 months of shows. I hadn't seen something and like life had changed dramatically. Like someone came up and was like, where do you put the kerosene in that tape deck, facetiously, because it was so outdated and I was still using analog and stuff. So, at that point when the investment was getting too high, I still loved the band. And I taped every single show that I went to from show, 10 to show 120 or something. And then I just gave up taping. But, I had, several years where I was taping a fairly good amount of shows every month.
Do you recall like specifically what the first show was that you taped with that?
The first show that I taped was at Hunt in the fall of '87. I think it was one of their last few shows there, a really tiny room. And, when I came back to Ithaca, I was going to Cornell at the time. And, I wanted to have something because we were going up to Burlington to like check this band out periodically. And I came back and then I started taping. They would play the place in Ithaca called the Haunt, which is no longer there. And small clubs like that, Clementines or Clements in Syracuse, and mostly bars. And it was mostly bars in, 1987, 1988 and stuff like that.
So where were you putting the mics when you were in those clubs and bars?
The first few dozen shows, it was literally on the stage. I would just get there a little early. You'd go in, you wouldn't need a ticket, of course, back then. It was just, pay the bouncer sitting on the stool $5 or, sometimes there was no cover charge. They'd stamp your hand, let you know that you had paid or checked your ID. And, I'd walk in 10 minutes before the show and just stick my recorder right on the stage. And, then the stages were getting a little bit bigger. And then, sometimes I would have to duct tape microphones to the wood rafters. A lot of these clubs had really small ceilings. So just like a step stool or a bar stool, you get up to the roof and you would just ask the bouncer or the sound guy or Paul, hey man, can I put some microphones here? And, back then at the time too, Paul was, you could plug into the soundboard periodically too, if he wasn't harried or busy, and, you would just find a way there. But I mean, I zip tied stuff to lights, to AC, ceiling registers, to anything that was like sturdy. Packing up before a show was like batteries, microphones, cables, duct tape, zip ties. A couple of my friends used to call me MacGyver because every weekend I was going to a Phish show somewhere and I was grabbing, I had like a little toolkit, like a little like vinyl kit that just had like tools and shit to like mount stuff places. Because a lot of these places, there was no room for a tripod. And then like 1990, 91, it started becoming theaters and, bigger clubs where there was, place to set back a riser in the back where you could put a tripod and mic stands and stuff like that. But, the first part of the years, it was just wherever we could. And the clubs were so small, it didn't much matter where you put the microphones, frankly. There was kind of some awkward acoustics, low ceilings, stuff was bouncing off and stuff. So wherever you could, wherever you could find the space.
Were you at the January '89 Paradise shows, Parker?
I sure was.
Yeah. Do you have any recollections of specifically of those shows?
Well, it's funny. I know that show is got such lore with the band, but at the time, again, there was no internet back then. There was no, I think it was like 1992 or 3 before I was on the internet myself. And I had a small circle of friends at school and a small circle of taper friends, but I wasn't really part of the Burlington, band culture where I didn't realize it was like such a big event that, chartering the bus. And at the time it was just like, hey, they're playing at the Paradise. Okay, let's try to get down there. I didn't realize that it was, that they had like basically rented it out from what I remember. Like
you lived in Massachusetts though at the time, right?
Well, I was from Massachusetts, but I was going to school.
You were still in Ithaca.
So it was still a 6-hour drive.
Oh, right. Wow. Yeah, no, okay.
We'd come back to, Boston, and, being in Ithaca was great because I could get to Buffalo, Syracuse, Albany, New England, Poughkeepsie, Hudson Valley, New York City, wetlands. Everything was 3-4 hours, maybe 5 hours. And it was kind of, I could go west a little bit, but they weren't going much west of there, maybe Rochester, Buffalo type of thing. But, Ithaca was a cool spot. We could travel around, see a lot of shows.
So you were really in the thick of it when Phish was was basically, phenomenologically growing, and
Oh,
from 89 through 94,
89,
95.
90, 91, you blinked and, like, I always tell people, I make an analogy to Amy's Farm, that was kind of like, that was like almost an end of an era. That was like when the genie was definitely out of the bottle. When that word got out, I just knew that fall that the venues were going to be getting bigger, and clubs that they had been playing in the Haunt, all of a sudden it's the State Street Theater, or it was a Clements Brew Pub became, the old State Theater, whatever. They were upgrading the venues, and that was right around 91, 92, and then things just went stratospherically after that. And then, a lot of the shows, it was me and Kevin Shapiro taping, for example.
Kevin
Or
Shapiro, the Phish's archivist,
one other
right?
person, or maybe no other people. And then, before long, it was, 12, 15, nothing like what, Charlie was talking about, 35 people, but, it wasn't that long before there were, decks with, a octopus of squid wires of, 15 people off of a deck or two. And, it got stratospheric pretty quickly. Absolutely.
And
I remember seeing it, I remember going to places with 500 people, like this band, I can't believe they're selling 500 seats. I really thought, I love Phish, but I never thought that they would get to, when they were playing the Boston Garden and even the Centrum and places like that. I was like, oh my God, this is a band that, we'd seen 14 people in a dorm room.
Yeah, it was late 94 when, they played the Centrum and the Garden, right? Is that right? Yeah, on the New Year's run. But you mentioned Amy's Farm. Did you tape that with your own mics, or did you
I
patch
taped
out
that
at
with my
Amy's
own
Farm?
mics. Yep.
Do you recall like how many people patched out of you at Amy's Farm?
I probably had 2 or 3. I never had the best mics in the group. Everyone knew they could depend upon me. I'd always have fresh batteries. I'd always flip at the right time. I knew exactly, I was pretty good. People would always look over at me like, trying to get the check. Should we be flipping after here? Because like back then, before digital, it was like, the flip, especially in the second set, was critical.
And you knew the music. That's why you were able to flip.
What's that?
You knew the music. You knew when to.
Right. So like, I was kind of dependable in that way, but like, I didn't have the, $5,000 mic. So I would have a couple of people, hey man, do you mind me patching out of you? And I'd be like, sure, you can patch out of me, or you can patch out of him. His microphones were like, 16 times the price of mine. But, there were probably a couple dozen people taping that show.
Yeah. And to be clear, you were taping analog up until the end.
That's right. I got right when digital audio tape became a thing. I bought, my first Panasonic 3700, I think it was called, and it was $1,200 or $1,500. It was a big investment, and then I realized pretty quickly, well, what the hell am I doing? I can't. What does one do me? It's not portable. People might send me some tapes, but I'm not going to be trading analog. So I had to get a second, to make copies and stuff, and to keep the trading going. So I did that for a few years, but never portably.
Did you typically use a 100-minute tape for second sets and a 90-minute tape for the first?
No, almost always 90. Almost always.
You just knew when to flip them. So
you just knew when to flip them, and it was like one song could make all the difference.
Right. And you am I right that you said you taped at Hunt's, you taped at the Paradise, you taped basically at most of the venues.
All the venues that Phish has been storied at in the late 80s, early 90s, in the Mid-Atlantic and New England, and even down to like the Cat's Cradle and Tracks, and some of the 8x10 Club. I think
in 91, right?
Up and down the East Coast, Mid-Atlantic. I did some Georgia stuff. I did some North Carolina stuff. I did a bunch of stuff out west, in the early 90s, but most of the venues that are in the Mid-Atlantic Northeast, I probably taped at least once.
So you were in Colorado in 1990?
Yep. I did
Great.
Halloween. I did Halloween 2 years there, as well as Red Rocks at Colorado College for 2 years. I was 90, 91, I think it was. I taped those shows too.
And you were at the front, right? In Burlington in 91, like the last front show.
I was at the last front show, yeah. And I had taped a handful of shows there, and a great, that always had the culture of being, Phish's hometown venue, even though they had a lot of venues in Burlington. And there was a show the night before, which I don't remember too many details of, but I know there was 2 shows, and I could not get to the first show. And I called Kuroda, And I said, and I was like freaking out. And I was like, you know, I want to get to Burlington. I want to be at the last show. I want to tape it. And I can't get there until like 7 o'clock. I've got a class or an exam or something. I can't leave it. Like, can you make sure I get a ticket? And he's like, Parker, relax. It's fucking Burlington. No, don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. You know, they play up here all the time. I'm like, yeah, but it's the last show. I mean, they had a decent crowd. It was full, but it was not sold out. But I taped
Right.
the last show at the front. Yep.
Yeah, because speaking of the front, on the panel today is Todd Ahrens. Todd, are you there?
Yep.
Hi, Todd.
I am.
So
Hi, thanks for having me.
Todd actually taped the final 2 front shows, I believe, right, Todd? And then you were apparently the only taper at that
At the
511
night
show.
before it was a 21 and over show. So
Yeah, tell us about that show.
Well, I didn't have a lot of experience at that time, and the guy Dave I was traveling with, he couldn't get in. He wasn't 21, so he gave me the rig to bring in and tape. We borrowed, our friend had lent us his DAT and his Sheps. So yeah, I hustled in there, and probably at that show, at the first set, I would guess there was under 50 people. But I set up in the back, there were no other tapers. By the second set, it filled up, I'd say maybe 150, 200 people. Nothing like the last show, the next night, which, as Parker mentioned, probably wasn't sold out, but it was a full house for sure. That 511 show was one of the least crowded shows I've ever been to.
Yeah, and you think it's just because it was 21 and over?
I think, or maybe, you know, and actually that was a Saturday night, if I recall correctly. So that's pretty odd that it wouldn't
May 11th?
be. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not certain. Could look it up, but because I remember we had to get back on Monday for work and other stuff. So back to New York, and we drove right after the 512 show from Burlington. We probably got back to New York at 5 in the morning.
And then I should ask you, Todd, what was the first show that you patched out of, you know, a Phish show?
Well, my first show was 6/16/90 in Townsend, Vermont, and funny about that, we did tape that. My friend Doug and I, who I went with, we taped that, and he had, I guess it must have been a stereo mic. He had a really cheap, realistic Radio Shack mic. But at that first Townsend show, which is an amazing venue, Paul let everybody patch out, but Doug wanted to run the mics. So we ran the mics, and almost everybody took the patch. And there was something wrong with it throughout the first set, and there were a ton of dropouts. So the majority of people that taped that show, all the boards that are out there have, it's either a static digital noise or a dropout through several songs. I think they got that fixed up by the second set. But that crappy audio we have from the Radio Shack mic is one of the only sources that has the complete show without the dropouts.
And do you remember if those dropouts were because it was a digital copy that was being made, or were there problems with the analog feed?
Yeah, I don't know, because I would imagine at that time almost everybody was analog that was taping there.
June 1990.
Yes, spring of 90. And the PA wasn't dropping out for the band.
Right.
It was just that feed. So I'm guessing, you know,
the signal problem. Right.
Yeah.
And Todd, you actually taped with Dave Schenker, like almost the entire July 1991 Giant Country Horns tour, right?
Yeah, well, we did a bunch of the end of spring, April and May 91, and then all of the beginning of the Horn tour, and then Dave dropped off. I didn't go down to Atlanta, and then we did Amy's Farm as well. But yeah, did taped everything at least through Battery Park, through New York, Arrowhead. I can't remember if Academy in New York was before or after Arrowhead Ranch.
Arrowhead Ranch, I believe, was like July 21st, 1991.
21st and 22nd, yeah.
Yeah, that was the digital soundboard of Arrowhead Ranch is what helped get me back into Phish back then. It was just such
Great show.
Yeah, it was a great show, an amazing show, actually, I think. And
Cool
and
venue.
yeah, and that's from, I wasn't there, but I mean, I remember when I got those D soundboard tapes, they kind of blew my mind, frankly, and especially with the horns, hearing Phish at the horns for the first time like that was really incredible.
Great
Um, spe-
weekend.
yeah, and speaking actually of Arrowhead Ranch, also on the panel is Eliot Byron. Eliot, you still there?
I'm still here. Yep.
Great. Eliot, thank you for joining us. And it's my understanding that you actually got it with Phish at Arrowhead Ranch on in July 21st, 1991, even though of course you'd been seeing them for a while. And I should say to people watching that some of you may know Eliot from his work at the Capitol Theater in Portchester, New York over the years. Eliot, if you would please tell us about your first Grateful Dead show as well as your first Phish show and the first times you began taping both Grateful Dead and Phish.
Sure. I saw my first Grateful Dead show in 1987. It was between my junior and senior year of high school. We went up to Foxborough and saw the Grateful Dead and caught that bug pretty quick. And then, would see, tons of shows up and down the East Coast. And at one point, a friend of ours, we were heading west to Oakland for the Chinese New Year shows in February. And a friend of ours could not make those shows, and he had a tape deck. So he bestowed his Sony D6 cassette deck to me, and I brought it out west, patched in and recorded my first Grateful Dead show. And the concept of being able, after years of, not being able to hear the shows right away, having that to play in the hotel room, in the car, on the way to the next shows, like that was just such a great concept to us. And, so I got my own deck pretty quick after that and started taping everything I would go see. And at the time we were seeing tons of New York City bands. And, I had seen Phish once at the Wetlands before that in 1990, but it wasn't like I was going to see Phish that night. We just hung out at Wetlands every night. And that's just who was playing one night when we were there. And a couple of months after that, we were going up to Arrowhead Ranch to see a bunch of New York City bands that were playing over that weekend. And Phish was the headliner those nights. And that's when I really caught the Phish bug. Seeing them with the giant country horns up there was a fantastic show. And that was my aha moment for Phish. And I was all in at that point.
What was the first Grateful Dead show you taped? Was it the Mardi Gras?
It was Mardi Gras in 91, I believe. Yeah.
Right. And then, is that how, when you got the taping bug, so to speak, or was it later?
Oh yeah, that was, we were really grooving on the fact, like I said, that we could listen to the shows right away after it. And soon after that, I bought a Sony D5 and would patch in, and then ended up getting a set of Nakabichi 300 microphones soon after that. And that's that, the rest, as they say, is history.
Do you remember when you got those 300s?
No, I can't recall that right now. I don't have that encyclopedic memory that most people have. Back then, it was a blur.
If I'm correct, though, you recorded the Roseland Ballroom in '92. Was it with Sheps?
Sure. There was a friend of ours, we had, through the years, we were patching out of different microphones and, made our way to recording with DAT decks. So there were points when, between me and my friends, we had, 3 or 4 different decks running, and we would patch out of, different mic setups at each show. And, quickly realized that certain microphones were giving us much better results. And a friend of mine who had, done pretty well for himself at the time, he started commenting that, the way we were listening to stuff in our cars and our little, little speaker systems were just not revealing the capabilities of the recordings that, some people were making. And he had the wherewithal to, to tell us, if you could have any set of microphones, what would you have? And, we told him we, thought the Sheps were making the best recording for what we were doing. And he went out and bought a set and basically told me to just keep using these. And that's how it happened, for me at least. And, he just knew that was the best thing to do. We were going to spend the time making the recordings. We might as well make the best recordings possible.
And it just dawned on me that for those watching who may not, understand, we should probably talk about batteries and about tape flips, because, most people don't listen to cassette tapes anymore, obviously. And cassette tapes, back in the day, I haven't even tried to buy any recently. I assume they're still available, but they used to be 90 minutes, 100 minutes, 110 minutes. And when you're recording
Sure.
with one, you'd have to flip it. And usually the batteries would be fine for an analog deck. But my understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Eliot, but like with DAT, when DAT showed up, initially the batteries wouldn't last long, right? And so you didn't have to worry about generational loss with analog or flipping a tape, but you did have to worry about the batteries dying on you with DAT.
Sure.
Right?
We, when as Parker alluded to, the big trick at Phish, and at some respects the Grateful Dead, was when to flip your tape. At the Grateful Dead it was easy. The first set, one song would end, you'd flip your tape over and just hit record and start going again. Anytime there was a break towards, after 40 minutes into the show, you could flip and go. And second set was easy. It always fell during drums in space. It was, let the tape run out and then flip it over. And if you missed them, a second or two of drums here and there, nobody really minded. But at Phish, it became, a little game where to flip the tape. And if you flipped too early, you ran the chance of running out of tape before the end of the set. So when DAT came along, the tapes were, much longer. But the portable decks, the batteries that they came with were, at their maximum peak, brand new state, could only record for 40 to 45 minutes. So and there was no AC power available to us at the shows, still isn't to this day. And so we very, quickly had a learning curve of, we were using, motorcycle batteries and, emergency lighting for, stairway lighting batteries, 12 volt, 6 volt, lead acid power supplies that could run, much longer. And we figured out how to tap into the AC power port on the side of the deck and get those decks to record, much longer periods of time. And it changed everything. And at that point, when we were making digital recordings, everybody having, this long chain of decks wasn't as important anymore, because, when everything was analog, having the master mattered. It was a better recording. When you would make generational tapes, you would get the tape hiss of each tape along the way added onto each copy of the tape down the line. And once we were reliably recording digital, the generational thing didn't matter, and less people physically needed to patch out of at the show. It's still, people would do it to have the tape right away and, take it back to where they lived and started their own little tape trees in each little part of the country. But it was definitely a shift in the thinking at that point.
And Parker, you want to add something?
Yeah. I'll just kind of piggyback on what Eliot's saying. It was a quantum shift, the digital thing, not only in the sound quality, but I would keep very rudimentary tape lists of what I had and what I was trading for. Typewriter. I had what was called a Magnavox video writer, which was it kept data on a disk. It was kind of a computer word processor. It would save stuff, but we were just before Apple computers, made a big thing, and people didn't have laptops. So our tape lists were important and know what you could trade with. And zero for me, on my nomenclature was my master. That's what I have as a zero. And then a one, from a one plus was someone that I trusted and knew. It's if he's telling me it's coming from his master, I know for certain it's a first gen master. Sometimes you get people, oh, I'll send you this. It's coming from the master. It's first gen. But we all had our own lists and our own nomenclature, 1A, B, grading, 2, 3, 4. But
yeah, is it a 0 or a 1 for a master?
After second gen, third gen, like Eliot says, forget about it. The hiss, and then when you started getting lists and you realize with the digital that it didn't matter, it was kind of like a quantum leap of thinking of recording and how, wow, we can send this recording to 1,000 people and have it be the same as the first recording without worrying about, you know, who taped what, you know, when
Right, generational
ones
loss.
and zeros instead of like the analog, and even making the copies. Some people would like use the automatic tape deck that would do the flip for you, which when it recorded in reverse, if you didn't do it, it wasn't really the same. And sometimes you get tapes that like the second side didn't sound as good as the first side, and so you knew the person like that recorded
Yeah, the
it on
pitch
a flip.
shifted. The pitch would shift.
But
Yeah, so
the digital thing was quite a thing, and not having to worry about the cuts in the flips, and not having to worry about the generational loss. It was
you know,
like
this is really a question, Parker, for you and Todd and Eliot. But like the Arrowhead Ranch show, I mean, the D soundboard of that show was circulated, you know, widely among, you know, not just Phish fans, but, you know, Grateful Dead and fans of Allman Brothers and other bands back
it
then.
did. And Charlie, it's funny that you said that, because there was a big biker contingent up there that weekend. There was
Yeah, and like, but you know, well, where I'm going with this is, do you guys remember when Paul started having like an exclusive, or I don't even remember if he was exclusive for a while, digital soundboard as opposed to an analog board, or was he recording both
Yeah,
digitally and analog at times, or?
For years there was, you know, the only digital recordings that would, you know, master soundboard recordings would come from when somebody brought a studio deck and would give it to Paul to patch into the soundboard. Before then, you know, they just weren't widely used. So like Parker said, it was a generational shift. It really changed the game.
Do you guys remember when Paul, because I know Paul for years and years would let, as Parker, you talked a little bit about this, Paul would let people patch out of the soundboard sort of now and then. But there came a time when he definitely stopped allowing it. And I remember in fall '94, the first, I think it was it had to have been the first set of the Warner Theater Erie show, someone leaned over from the taper section right before the music started and was able to patch in to the digital board. And that's why I think it's that Erie '94 show. I think it's November 13, maybe. That only the first set circulated in as a D soundboard, and the second set circulated in analog, or excuse me, just you know, audio or audience.
Well, you know, when it was in smaller clubs, and you know, it was before I was recording, but you know, even still to this day, when you're in a small club, you know, certain instruments are filling the club naturally. You know, the bass is filling the club, the drums are filling the club, the guitar is, you know, so well and loud that they don't need to put that into the sound system. So in the earlier years, the soundboard recording was, you know, most likely was not the truest capturing of the experience that you had in the room at that night. So, you know, the experience that Parker had placing his, you know, microphones on the stage in a club where there was probably only the vocals going through the PA system was definitely the way to go. You know, and once the venues got much bigger, theaters, amphitheaters, you know, and then on to arenas, you know, having the soundboard tape was a lot more viable, but it wasn't available to us. So that's when we, you know, a lot of people decided that going up front, being FOB in the throat of the sound system, so to speak, was the way to get what we were looking for the after show listening experience. And
do you remember, Eliot, since you know, something you said made me think of it for some reason, but do you remember, like, to what extent the size of the Phish taper section changed between, let's say, like Bender Arena '93? I don't know, were you at Bender Arena in '93, or
I was not.
Were you at New Year's '93?
I was.
Okay, yeah. Do you recall, like, just even generally, like how you know, how large the taper section was then as compared with, say, like 12/31 '94 Boston Garden or MSG in '95?
there were, 10 or 12 mic stands with, a small handful of decks coming out of each one. But very shortly after that, I was up front all the time. I mean, those Roseland shows that I spoke of earlier, in 92, I was in front of the board. And that's where I spent most of my time. I would pop into the taper section before the show started just to open my bag up, get everything preset and ready to go. And then I would,
And you had friends in the
make
taper
my-
section, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even if I didn't have a taper ticket, if you would all work together. It was definitely a community. If one person had had a taper ticket, they could, carry in a bunch of gear, and it was only that one moment you were going through the door that you had to worry about it. So we could all carry our stuff right up to the ticket tear, hand one person 2 or 3 of our bags. They would walk through the door with like a Sherpa full of, all of our equipment. And right after we were through the turnstiles, we would all take our gear back and be on our way. And that's one of the things also that attracted me to taping and sticking with it is, the community of it. It was just a great bunch of people and made a lot of friends that I still have to this day, for sure.
Did you tape?
Can I jump in real quickly
Sure.
talking about the Sherpa in the equipment? That equipment and Sherpa stuff saved me on a couple of occasions where, we all had our Pelican style cases and tripods and gear and stuff. And on more than one occasion when the band was getting bigger and the clubs were selling out and I'd show up late without a ticket available, I would just grab my gear, make it look like I was part of the band. I'd get some cables, throw them over my shoulder like I was an electrician, and I would just go in the door as if they were waiting for me. And I did that probably 3 or 4 times that I can remember, and using the equipment to quote unquote get me in.
Yeah, you have to practice the response. The question is, are you with the band? The answer is always yes. There has to be absolutely zero hesitation. Rehearsed. You have to be, if you think about it for a split second, if somebody asks you if you're with the band, you're not with the band.
I came out one time, we were coming down from Ithaca to the Capitol Theater, same thing, and I bumped into Big Phil. And I was like, Phil, these tickets are impossible. I think Widespread Panic was opening or something. He's like, just come with me, Parker. We'll do this. Like, it's not going to work at the Capitol. He's like, just come with me. And, Phil's big enough that he can kind of just muscle his way in. So grab my equipment, put the stuff over my shoulder. And, Phil starts yelling, we're going to be late. Come on. We're going to be late. We're going to be late. And he just barrels through two bouncers. And we come
carrying
out
a huge video camera.
And we come out and it was like 15 minutes before lights. And we're like, on stage, coming out into the crowd, and there's people like, Parker, what the fuck are you doing up there? Sneaking into the Capitol.
Yeah, you can't do that anymore.
No.
No, this entire thing is basically Exhibit A for, it's like an advertisement for front of board taping, which of course is generally disallowed at venues. But
I was just gonna say, back to your original question, I don't know when Paul stopped doing digital, or when he went exclusively to digital, but it's worth noting that, prior to even 91, I bet, he didn't generally tape as a rule. There's a ton of shows from 87, 80, he wasn't always running board tapes for the band. So, that's probably, would spur Parker to go. And that's what, but he wouldn't do that, every show. So I don't think that was probably until like 91 tour that he started actually, formally documenting everything.
Right.
Yeah, like
no,
I said, if you
point.
didn't have the time to make a separate mix for the tape, there was 2 separate mixes, what the room was doing and what the tape was doing. And if you didn't have enough time during the afternoon to make a separate matrix of what was going to be going to the tape, it for the most part wasn't worth it until, multi-track recording came along and they could record, everything coming off the boards and mix it down later. But that was, a totally different ballgame.
Yeah, it looks like Phil never taped my first Phish show at the Paradise in October '89, and it doesn't circulate. So I've actually never heard it since, which is rather ironic given how much Phish music I spread, especially in the 1990s. But I still have not heard my first show since October 6, '89. On that happy note, let's speak now about 1995 taping. And actually, I should ask you, Eliot, were you taping in fall '95 FOB with your chefs?
Yes.
Okay,
For
so
sure.
would you think you were at Hershey 95?
I was at Hershey and it was either 95 or 96. Yep.
And Craig, so Craig, are you still on? Hopefully you are.
I'm right here.
Hi,
How are
Craig.
you, Charlie? Thank you
I'm
for having
okay.
me.
Sure, yeah. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, was your first show like Hershey 95?
Yes, but only for not for a lack of effort. As you know, I mean, that was 94, 95 was the years that I was a new law associate. So I had a couple of false starts. I bought a bunch of tickets for the Mann Center in 94 and ended up eating those because of new associate syndrome. I think, or not man, actually my first show would have been Philly Civic Center 94, and then Man 95 I also had to eat tickets. So by the time fall 95 rolled around, my buddy Stan Lobitz couldn't go to Hershey, so he sent me his tickets. So I had a DAT deck. I was just a patcher at the time, and I found a friend and went up to Hershey and found out that you actually needed tapers tickets to get your deck in. So I wasn't able to get my deck in. And but Hershey 95 was my first show. Had very little idea what was going on. I had a few DATs of Phish, thanks to the efforts of several of the speakers before me. But that was my first show.
Did you get, because
And
that's an amazing show. I mean, did you get it with Phish at that show, or was it somewhere else?
I don't think I got it at that show for a number of reasons. You know, didn't know the material as well. And the sound was really bad in that room. I mean, it's the old Hershey Civic Arena is an old minor league hockey rink, but it's of the old armory era of concrete. It was just a concrete shell, and it sounded like it, and none of the audience tapes were really worthwhile listening to. So I mean, it wasn't even worth listening back to me because there were so many other great tapes from fall 95 that were worth listening to, from the Fox Theater, Orlando 95, Halloween, among others. So I never really got into it until it was released. I think at one of the first live Phish releases, I believe.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's right. But do you recall when you first got it with Phish, or do you want to talk, or is it like a story you can't tell publicly?
I think the first time I really got it with Phish might have been, I guess it would have been my fifth show. So I had such a good experience at Hershey that I decided, well, now I'm going to do it right, and I'm going to buy my own microphones, because after all, that's why I went to law school, and buy my own microphones to go with my DAT deck, and I'm going to tape a real Phish show. So I got my act together. I figured out mail order. I mail ordered taper tickets for New Year's run. And back then you could actually get
95
taper tickets through mail order. Yeah, it wasn't hard.
I think that
at
was
all.
the first time, actually, that of the summer, that you could get tapers tickets through mail order. It was, I think I looked it up, at least I meant to, but it's in my brain for some reason now. But I believe that was the first time you could get a tapers ticket through Phish, for mail order, through mail order for, through Shelley and Phish tickets by mail, and the Doniac Schvice back then. So you recorded, did you record the entire New Year's run in 95, or was it just MSG?
Just the garden run. So between Hershey, which was on 12/1/95, and the New Year's run at the end of the year, I also got my act together, and based on the work of people like Eliot, a lot of dead tapers that I'd come to collect taping Grateful Dead, people like Jeff Kravitz and Ted Mattis, and a lot of people who were taping with Shep's microphones. I knew exactly what I wanted. And if I was going to put the effort into a new hobby, I wanted to have the microphones that I wanted to have, and I didn't want to have any regrets. So I bought a new pair of Shep's, and I actually borrowed a preamp from Stan Lobitz, who was a new friend of mine I just met. Patched out of him a couple times. He had an Ode preamp that he loaned me. And I thought that was cool. That he didn't really know me that well, but he was willing to ship a $1,200 preamp to me because he knew that I was taking my brand new Shep's and a DAT deck to the Garden to tape Phish on their first of many New Year's Garden runs. So that was my first experience taping Phish at what many people consider to be one of the worst 12:30 shows of all time and one of the best 12:31 shows of all time.
Yeah, 1995. The first MSG show was a year earlier, though, right? Is it 12/30/94? Or am I misremembering that?
No, I think you're correct. I believe so.
Okay. Yeah, so the 12/30 was, did Prince Caspian open 12/30/95? I remember being really relieved and sitting, I was really tired. But anyway, that's another.
It did, but it was okay
webcast.
because I didn't know it then.
There you go. And yeah, it's a song I love. So don't get me wrong, but it's at the time it was, it was interesting for an opener choice.
Is it true that you named an article of clothing after the song?
I don't recall. I don't think so. So 12/31/95, one of the most incredible shows in Phish history. If I remember correctly, your recording of that, your Shep's recording, I remember people really, really liking it on Rec Music Phish. And I remember getting a copy of it I got as many copies from different mic sources of that show as I could get to do comparisons. And I think I should also ask you about Team Shep's. And how all that started, because I remember reading about it on Rec Music Phish in I don't know, it might have been more like 96 or 97. But can you talk about Team Shep's and how that whole thing started?
Sure. Well, right about the time that I started taping was coincidentally about the same time that the .com bubble started, 95, 96. And with the .com bubble came a couple of things, a boom in digital technology and miniaturization of digital technology, and a lot of young people coming out of college with six-figure ridiculous salaries from companies rich in VC cash. So this led to an influx of amazing rigs into the Phish taping section. After 1995, I think maybe the New Year's 95 run, I was one of three people in the taper section who had Shep's microphones. A lot of people had lower cost microphones, AKGs, Nakamichis, and the like. Within a couple of years, you couldn't go to a show and not see 7, 8, 10 pairs of Shep's in the taping section. And I was a taping section taper. I like to be able to set my rig and enjoy the show. I never wanted to wear a hat. I never wanted to be distracted by the anxiety of getting caught. Some people thrive on that old school sort of kamikaze, take my mics if you can. Not me. I like to set it and forget it in the taper section and enjoy the show and see my friends and wander around the arena. So I never got the FOB taping bug. I tried it once, which was my third Phish show taping. So I guess New Year's 95 left the mark. So I figured, okay, I'll go to Jazz Fest and I'll try to tape Phish at Jazz Fest because there's no taping allowed, and that'll be pretty cool, and I'll be cool, and I'll tape Jazz Fest. And I did. I snuck my Sheps in.
April
I wore
'96, right?
Yep, I wore the mics in the hat, and I got a really great tape of it. And it was the tape that everybody got because there was no taping allowed, and nobody else was releasing any tapes that I knew of at the time. There was maybe 2 or 3 other stealth rigs at the show, but the experience of standing out in an open field in New Orleans in May in the humidity and heat, and standing still and not being able to groove to EM, I decided then and there that wasn't for me. So lesson learned. And I think the next summer is when I really just sort of went overboard. And a mutual friend of ours named Eric Vanderkar, rest in peace, who called a bunch of us up separately and said, hey, so and so and so and so, Stan and Saverick are going to Red Rocks, you got to come too. So he called us up and he convinced us all into going to Red Rocks. Stan Lobitz, who back then was just a taper music fan, now is famous for his work being the archivist for Mo. Glad to say that I knew him then. And he never one to not take a joke overboard. He silkscreened some shirts that said Red Rocks Team Sheps Taping Crew, and we all got these Team Sheps shirts to commemorate our trip to Red Rocks. And that was really sort of when the inside joke began. But it also captured, I think, what is an ethic of that Eliot and some of the others had mentioned, is that one thing about Sheps microphones that we all liked is the Colette system is modular. So you have different capsules that have different polar patterns, and they plug and play basically with a variety of microphone amplifiers. They can be in stealth configurations, they can be in non-stealth configurations, you name it. And they're all really, really expensive. So you can't get them all. They're not like Pokemon. And everybody has their different tastes and flavors. But the cool thing is that they're all interchangeable. So if somebody had a pair of capsules that you wanted to try, they would loan them to you. If somebody was going on tour and you couldn't go on tour, you might loan them some gear so that they could run an extra rig. And the rent was always a set of DAT masters, and it was that team ethic that sort of really underscored what Team Sheps came to mean. But if you're making t-shirts and hats and you have I think Stan registered the domain name .org domain name too. So we took it overboard, but it was fun while it lasted.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, enough probably hasn't been said to thank tapers like you and the other Team Sheps folks for not only going through the hassles of taping a show. There could be many, as you guys know better than most, but also just circulating the recordings. I mean, it just I cannot thank you and other tapers enough for your efforts. And I think this is actually probably a good way to conclude. I wanted to thank all of you guys again for being on this panel, and also obviously for all of your efforts taping, and all of your friends' efforts taping and circulating the music. So thank you all very much. And I also wanted to thank my fellow board member, Dr. Stephanie Jenkins, who's been helping with the recording of this. And the Mockingbird Foundation would also like to thank everyone who's ever donated time or money to the foundation over the years. And of course, we would also like to thank Phish, Phish's archivist, Kevin Shapiro, and Phish's charitable arm, the Water Wheel Foundation, for their support over the last 25 years. Thank you again, guys. Greatly appreciate it.
All right.
Thank
Charlie.
you. Thank you,
Appreciate it.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.